So I want to first thank everybody who comes out here and everybody who makes coming out here possible, because this is incredibly important to give them a piece of our minds up here. And thank you to all of you for that. It's really, really important. The camaraderie and the solidarity that we all get to share, and the moments of resolve that we have against the forces that are against us are a necessity, and we cannot do without them, especially right now. So, as I read this, there are going to be a few times where I say land back, and I'm going to pause, and I ask that in response, you all yell land back. So I'd say land back, and you all would say
land back!
Land back. Cool. Beautiful. Okay. I also have a little bit of social anxiety, so some of this is hard to get through. Please bear with me. Okay. There is a lot of beauty in the stand that is taken when we get together on these Fridays, and many of the people here have dealt in very personal ways with very heavy and deeply traumatic experiences. And for many other reasons, I know it can be hard for a lot of us to take right now to think really seriously and in an in-depth way about subjects like intentional, intergenerational, targeted suffering being inflicted, and it can make us all emotional and at times overwhelmed, especially when you have personal connections to that suffering. However, every time we join together in protest, it's imperative that we remember why we're fighting these fights. So let's turn now to thinking very seriously about the history that brought Indigenous people to this moment. And in doing so, let's think about the beautiful land that this history took place on. Let's be grateful to it and honor it. But let's also think about how we got here. And most importantly, who the people really are, who it has been and continues to be cruelly stolen from. Let's not just acknowledge the reality of the suffering that Indigenous people constantly face, but let's devote some time to really thinking about it, and let's remember to take the truth with us into the future and make it a reason we say abolish the police, make it a reason we say abolish prisons, make it a reason we say food, water, shelter, treatment, and health care for all, and remember that it is the reason we shout land back.
Land back!
Here in what is now called Portland, in what is now called Oregon, we can see the absence of the original culture of the generations of people who took care of this land for thousands of years. We can see the pervasive whiteness. The genocide of 10 million Native people in North America is often glossed over in public schools in Portland and around the United States. But what can go unseen is how diverse and determined Oregon's Native American population is, and how violent and unresolved the history of this place is. For thousands of years, more than 60 tribes lived in Oregon's diverse environmental regions. At least 18 languages were spoken across hundreds of villages. Portland's Native American community is descended from more than 380 tribes, and it is the 9th largest Native American community in the United States. There are 9 sovereign Native American nations located in Oregon, and Native American people from this area have repeatedly appealed to the broader community to recognize and commit to solutions that are built in partnership with their community, and to enact commitments that recognize that prosperity and well-being for all in Multnomah County depends on the prosperity and well-being of the Native American community. As it was put by the Coalition of Communities of Color, quote, "The Native American population in Oregon continues to recover from the legacy of colonization and the practices of various governments that have alternated in approaches to public policy." That legacy of colonization is heartbreaking. After thousands of years of history, life as Indigenous people knew it was upended in just a few short decades. The invaders of the 1820s brought with them diseases that the native populations of the Oregon country had no immunity against. Waves of disease swept Indigenous communities in Oregon, with smallpox, measles, and unknown diseases killing hundreds of thousands. It is reckoned by one observer that 80% of the native population died in a single summer, with villages depopulated and the bare remnants of some tribal groups absorbed into others. In the early 1830s, the Oregon Trail had established a direct route to the Pacific Northwest. white settlers began to arrive in large numbers in the early 1840s, before any treaties were signed, and before indigenous people had surrendered any of their land, the government began to officially give it away. The Oregon Donation Land Act was passed in 1850, and it offered 320-acre parcels to thousands of white immigrants. In just a few years' time, white people would claim 2.8 million acres of stolen land. The government encouraged white people to make the journey and then gave the indigenous people's land away for free. White people, with the support and the command of the federal government, then facilitated the systemic brutality and removal of the remaining indigenous people and their placement into reservations. White people attempted and failed to establish boarding schools here and completely terrorized indigenous people. Numerous genocides followed. None of this history can be ignored. These are some of the reasons we must give the land back.
Land back.
There are 7 reservations in Oregon today. Reservations make up only 1.6% of land in Oregon, and of course only federally recognized tribes have any claim to land, and much of that land is held in trust. To reiterate, 98.4% of land in Oregon has been taken from its rightful caretakers. The Cow Creek Band of Umpqua tribe and the Klamath tribes, 2 of the 9 recognized tribes, have no reservation land at all. In the 1950s, over 100 indigenous tribes saw the end of federal recognition status, mostly in the western United States. From the 1950s through the late 1980s, 6 of the 9 tribes in Oregon had to fight day by day to reclaim their sovereignty and the little land they had left all over again. Oregon tribes rapidly lost their rights to legal jurisdiction and federal recognition as the federal government invalidated its treaty agreements. Some of these issues only ended as late as 1993. As of 2008, almost a third of Native Americans in the United States live on reservations, totaling approximately 700,000 people. About half of all Native Americans living on reservations are concentrated on the 10 largest reservations. The poverty rate on U.S. reservations was 28.4%, compared with 22% among all Native Americans on and off reservations, and the U.S. poverty rate among all groups is much lower at 12.7%. In addition to poverty rates, reservations are hindered by undereducation, lack of health care, low employment, substandard housing, and insufficient infrastructure. Native Americans report themselves as under frequent mental stress, 20% more than other populations. Indigenous people in the United States have higher rates of disease, higher death rates, and often little to no medical coverage. Fascism, capitalism, colonization, white supremacy, and white people are to blame. Across America, around 90,000 Native American families are either homeless or are considered underhoused. This can be seen as a direct result of conditions on reservations. It is also because of the conditions on reservations that the heart-wrenching stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women and children are made possible. Lisa Brunner, Executive Director of Sacred Spirits First National Coalition, states, quote, "What's happened through U.S. federal law and policy is they created lands of impunity where reservations are like playgrounds for serial rapists, batterers, killers, whoever, and our children aren't protected at all." In the U.S., Native American women are more than twice as likely to experience violence than any other demographic. 1 in 3 Indigenous women is sexually assaulted during her life, and 67% of these assaults are perpetrated by non-Indigenous perpetrators. Until 2013, most tribes didn't even have the jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute felony domestic violence offenses involving both Native American offenders and non-Native offenders on reservations. We must all work to bring awareness to the connection between sex trafficking, sexual harassment, sexual assault, and the women who go missing and are murdered. We know for a fact that the systemic inequities perpetuated on reservations and the heightened violence Native Americans face could stop if we'd simply do what must be done and give the land back.
Land back.
What land Native American people have left is constantly under attack from corporations and politicians. Water protectors and tribespeople who advocate for the land or their right to it are suppressed, arrested, imprisoned, and targeted, and their lives are destroyed so that their communities, traditions, and families can be destroyed too. Let's remember the root of the problem: the violent white colonizer invaders and their white supremacist, fascist offspring and successors. We can point to intergenerational wealth, we can point to the historicity and devastation of white supremacy, and we can look up to the companies and politicians who have facilitated and are facilitating the land theft, the poisoning, and the destruction of whole communities. We know who they are. That's how we know that it is the same white multimillionaires, billionaires, corporations, and political powers who are facilitating the erasure, the theft, the destruction of the people of this land, who are going and doing the same exact thing in the Amazon, the Pacific, and around the world. They are destroying this environment and the people who inhabit it, and trying to keep us divided, deprived, oppressed, and weak in a pathetic struggle for resources that aren't theirs, in places they don't belong, living lives they should not be living. We must hear the warnings about the future of our world. We must hear the pleas for help and change. We must help install Native American people as leaders, and we must make sure they get their land back. Native Americans are kept from the respect, dignity, human rights, self-government, reparations, and historical authorship they deserve. This is not in question, and this is not some future concern. This is a statement of fact, and it is preventable if we return the land. These stories are found in homes, in sacred spaces, on reservations, in the back of cop cars, in courtrooms, in jails and prisons, in back rooms and boardrooms, sometimes in textbooks, not often enough in classrooms, rarely accurately on the news, barely in public conversation, and even on these very streets. These atrocities have happened for hundreds of years, and they're happening right now. We're not just concerned, we're not just outraged, we're not just sending thoughts and prayers, we're not just sending a message to all the people in the building behind me. We will not stand idly by, and we will not be silent. We will remember that individually, each one of us is not able to stop what's happening to Native Americans all by ourselves, because that's impossible. But collectively, we can all rise together, rise up, and cause real, lasting change. It does require us, however, to band together and to see one another as humans deserving of each other's support and defense, just like the houseless community and just like all the other marginalized communities we've been talking about today. It requires us to organize around Indigenous leaders who stand up for themselves. It requires us taking a stand as one and giving the land back.
Land back.
What has happened to Native culture in what we call this country is absolutely horrific and is a terrible tragedy. But the decency, the dignity, the bravery, the resistance, the resilience, and the humanity that Indigenous people and those who help defend them continue to show over and over throughout history, including both the history that has been rewritten and the history that is unfolding around us, is a beautiful, honorable, inspiring thing, and it must always stay in our hearts and minds. Let the thought of the atrocities that happen here and that you want to stop from continuing resonate from deep inside you when we're out here and when we all get together and when we chant, "Land back."
Land back.